Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of someone else's silence press against your chest like a secret only you could feel? Imagine that silence wasn't just quiet, it was haunting, hollow, and stretched across months and sterile hospital walls. Now picture being the only person in the world who chooses to talk into that silence every single day, not knowing if your words are even heard. This isn't a fantasy or a fairy tale. This is the story of how a young nurse, a woman with no fame, no fortune, no spotlight, became the anchor that pulled a lost soul back from the edge of oblivion. And no, it didn't start with love at first sight. In fact, it started with no sight at all, because the man she cared for was trapped in a coma, drifting in the kind of darkness that most people never return from. What makes this story unforgettable isn't the medical miracle or the high-stakes drama that eventually unfolds, but the quiet truth sitting at its heart. Sometimes the most life-changing relationships begin when no one else is watching, and one person decides to stay when everyone else has left. Let's rewind. The hospital is immaculate but cold. Everything smells like antiseptic and expensive policies. Machines hum softly like they're whispering secrets, and behind one door on the top floor of the building is a patient who hasn't opened his eyes in over a year. His name is Grant Carter, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because it once ruled headlines and fortune covers. He was a billionaire by 32, an empire builder, a ruthless CEO who made his mark through mergers, media deals, and the kind of swagger that made investors swoon and competitors tremble. But then came the crash. Not metaphorical, literal. His car careened off a bridge one rainy night, and since then his existence has been limited to machines' V-drips and the kind of stillness that even time tiptoes around. Enter Anna Monroe, a nurse who didn't expect anything extraordinary when she started her shift that night. She didn't know she'd be assigned to care for a patient most of the staff had stopped believing in. She didn't know she'd walk into that opulent private suite and find a man who, despite being motionless, would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But what she did know was this: when you agree to care for someone who might never speak, you have to bring more than clinical skill. You have to bring heart. Let's pause here for a moment because this part matters. In every hospital around the world, there are patients like Grant, silent, forgotten, stuck between life and death, while nurses like Anna continue to show up. These nurses, many of whom will never be recognized or rewarded, talk to their patients, play music, hum softly, and whisper encouragements into ears that may never hear them. And yet they do it anyway. Why? Because healing isn't just about medicine. It's about presence. Anna brought presence. Every day, she didn't just change sheets and monitor vitals. She talked to Grant, told him about her life, shared complaints about cafeteria food, described the sunrises he couldn't see and the news he couldn't read. She even joked, teasing his lifeless expression with her own brand of dry humor. And here's where the story starts to shift, not in a cinematic burst, but in the subtle way reality sometimes blurs with hope. One day as she was bathing him, she felt something, the faintest twitch, a flicker of muscle beneath his wrist. Most people would have ignored it, but not Anna. She paused, watched, waited, and then days later it happened again. A twitch, a shift, barely perceptible but unmistakably real. Anna reported it to the head neurologist, who dismissed it as a reflex. Don't get your hopes up, they warned. But Anna wasn't hoping. She was noticing, and that difference matters. In real life, there's a growing body of research showing that coma patients may be more aware than we once believed. A 2017 study published in the journal Brain found that nearly 15% of patients previously diagnosed with unresponsive wakefulness showed signs of hidden awareness through brain imaging, meaning they could hear, feel, and think trapped in silence, just like Grant. And maybe that's why Anna's care started breaking through, because she wasn't just treating a body, she was speaking to a soul. Over time, her words became a ritual. She talked about everything: her dreams of moving to the countryside, her frustrations with stubborn doctors, her memories of growing up in a small town where kindness mattered more than credentials. She told Grant that even though he was rich and famous, she'd still roll her eyes if he complained too much. And every time she did, she swore his heart monitor beeped just a little louder. Whether it was coincidence or connection, she didn't care. She kept showing up. And then weeks into her routine, it happened. His fingers wrapped weakly around her wrist. Her world froze. The room didn't erupt in cheers. There were no alarms or triumphant music, just her staring at the hand that had moved. Deliberately, with purpose. He was waking up, not just physically but emotionally. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being locked inside your body, unable to move, speak, or cry out for help. And then imagine the first face you see when you finally open your eyes belongs to someone who never gave up on you, even though you had no way of proving you were still there. That's what Grant saw when he opened his eyes. Confusion, yes. Fear, of course. But above all, he saw Anna. And though he couldn't say much, his voice a dry rasp from months of silence, he said the one word that would change everything: company. It was fragmented, unclear. But to Anna, it was enough. That single word confirmed what she had hoped for all along. He heard her. He remembered. And he wasn't lost. In the days that followed, doctors scrambled to assess him. Therapists designed rehab plans. Specialists rushed in. Everyone suddenly remembered the billionaire in room 812. But Grant only had eyes for Anna. Why? Because when the world walked away, she stayed. And in that quiet space between who he was and who he'd become, she had become his tether. Let's zoom out again. This moment isn't just about a woman and a billionaire. It's about what we do with the people who can't reciprocate. It's about how we show up for others when there's nothing to gain. Studies in neuropsychology have shown that emotional stimulation, stories, music, touch can lead to improved recovery in coma patients. But it requires consistency, it requires faith, and most of all, it requires someone who refuses to believe silence means absence. Anna embodied that. She became the proof that care, when given selflessly, becomes transformative, not just for the patient, but for the caregiver too. As Grant's strength returned, first speech, then movement, then memory, Anna remained by his side. But something deeper had begun to form, a connection that wasn't about gratitude or dependence. It was about recognition. Grant didn't remember his life, not fully, but he remembered how Anna made him feel. Safe, seen, human. And that was the foundation neither of them expected, but both of them needed. Because real relationships, whether romantic, platonic, or spiritual, aren't built on perfection. They're built on presence, on who's there when everything else falls apart. As Grant began piecing together the fragments of his accident, new questions emerged. His coma wasn't just a random twist of fate. There were details, mechanical failures, financial anomalies, flashes of memory that hinted at something darker. And as the mystery deepened, so did his bond with Anna. But before we dive into that next chapter, let's pause and absorb the real-world echo. There are countless stories of caregivers who transform lives without ever knowing the full impact of their presence. Like the case of Rom Houben, a man in Belgium who was believed to be in a vegetative state for 23 years, until a new scan revealed his brain was fully active. His caregivers never gave up hope, and because of their efforts, he regained a connection with the outside world. Or consider Janine Shepherd, an Australian athlete paralyzed in a car accident who was told she'd never walk again. But a nurse, not a doctor, was the one who told her, "You'll get through this." That one voice became the spark for Janine to not only walk again, but become a pilot. These are real people, real recoveries, sparked by care that went beyond duty, just like Anna's. The human brain is a maze of memory, emotion, instinct, and mystery, a labyrinth where one small trigger can unlock an avalanche of forgotten moments, and where trauma often buries truth so deeply that it returns only in fragments scattered like puzzle pieces in the dark. For Grant Carter, the billionaire who had built his empire on precision and control, this newfound vulnerability was terrifying. He didn't just wake up to a changed world, he woke up to a self he no longer fully recognized. He was a man with power, yet powerless over his own mind. But in this vulnerability, something remarkable happened. Instead of pushing people away as he once might have, he leaned into the only person who had been there all along, Anna. She became his interpreter for a world he used to master, but now barely remembered. And for Anna, the weight of that responsibility wasn't intimidating. It was grounding. She didn't treat Grant like a project or a patient. She treated him like a man trying to rebuild himself. And that more than anything was what he needed. But let's shift from the personal to the collective for a moment. In traumatic brain injury, TBI rehabilitation, there's a growing field of relational therapy that focuses not just on recovery. through exercises, but on recovery through human connection. Researchers at Johns Hopkins have discovered that patients recovering from coma or brain injury respond more positively to familiar voices, compassionate touch, and consistent emotional presence than to purely clinical interventions. In other words, who helps you heal matters just as much as how you heal. And that's exactly what played out between Anna and Grant. Every physical gain he made lifting a spoon, standing unaided, speaking full sentences, was powered not just by neurons firing, but by the trust he placed in Anna's presence. Still, recovery isn't linear. For every good day there were setbacks. Grant became increasingly frustrated with his memory gaps. He couldn't recall what had led up to the crash, and the few flickers he did have felt wrong, like echoes from a nightmare he hadn't fully processed. One night after a long day of therapy, he sat in the hospital garden beside Anna. The air was crisp, the kind that makes silence feel sacred. "I don't know who I am without my past," he said quietly. Anna didn't respond with cliches. She didn't tell him everything would be okay. Instead, she said, "You are who you choose to become next." That moment, so quiet, so grounded, became a pivot point, because in it, Grant began to realize that the man he had been before the crash might not be the man he wanted to be after it. He remembered being powerful, yes, but also cold, calculated, emotionally armored. But now, in the presence of someone who saw him stripped of all status and still stayed, he felt something stirring that he hadn't allowed in years: softness, vulnerability, maybe even love. But with that softness came shadows. One night, a flash of memory came crashing in rain on a windshield headlight swerving into his lane, the brakes failing, and a dark figure standing on the side of the road. The realization struck like lightning. This wasn't an accident. Someone had tried to kill him. He told Anna immediately. She didn't try to calm him down or dismiss the vision. Instead, she listened, and then she investigated. Quietly, methodically, she accessed the hospital archives, combed through his case file, reviewed the police report, and then found what no one else had noticed: a note in the accident reconstruction suggesting deliberate tampering. The brakes hadn't just failed, they'd been altered. That changed everything. It wasn't just about healing now, it was about justice and safety, because whoever had wanted Grant dead once might try again. Let's pause and consider the weight of that revelation. Many stories treat attempted murder as a plot twist, but in real life, discovering someone wants you dead is a profound psychological rupture. It's not just about fear, it's about betrayal. It forces you to re-examine every relationship, every trust, every decision. And that's exactly what Grant did. He and Anna began going through his business records, family ties, and personal history. That's when the evidence pointed in one direction: Nathan Carter, his half-brother, the one who had always stood in his shadow, the one who had everything to gain if Grant disappeared. A large wire transfer made days before the crash funneled through a known criminal intermediary. It was damning and heartbreaking, because betrayal by a stranger is survivable. Betrayal by blood that shatters something deeper. In psychology, it's known as attachment injury, when someone you depend on for emotional or familial connection becomes the source of your pain. The healing from that is not just about justice, it's about rebuilding your very sense of self-worth. Grant confronted Nathan not with anger at first, but with disbelief. Why, he asked. Nathan's response was chillingly simple: "Because you always got everything." It was envy, yes, but also entitlement. Nathan had rationalized murder not out of desperation, but out of the belief that the world owed him what Grant had earned. But justice was swift. With evidence in hand, Grant and Anna worked with authorities to expose the plot. Nathan was arrested, and for the first time in months, Grant exhaled. He wasn't just healing his body, he was reclaiming his life. And through it all, Anna remained as constant. But now the air between them was changing. There was more than gratitude now. There was affection, long glances, lingering touches, half-spoken admissions. And yet both were cautious. Anna feared being seen as taking advantage. Grant feared moving too fast. But neither could ignore the gravity between them. One evening, while walking through the hospital gardens, again this time with Grant more steady on his feet, he stopped and took her hand. "I don't remember who I was before," he said, "but I trust you completely. Trust, not love, not yet. But in many ways, trust is more intimate. It's the foundation on which everything else stands. And Anna, she simply nodded, because she felt it too. In fact, let's explore why stories like this resonate so deeply. It's not just the romance. It's the idea that someone could see us at our absolute lowest, messy, broken, silent, and not walk away. That kind of loyal, that kind of patience feels almost mythical in our modern culture of instant gratification and disposable relationships. But stories like Grant and Anna's remind us that love born in silence often echoes the loudest. They're not just characters. They're archetypes for what we all long for: connection without performance, affection without conditions, safety without strings. Real-life examples of this aren't as rare as you might think. Consider the story of Richard and Maureen, a married couple in the UK. Richard suffered a severe stroke and was left in a nonverbal state. Doctors warned Maureen he might never recover, but she visited daily, reading him the newspaper and playing their favorite songs. Over time, he began responding first with eye movement, then with hand gestures, then speech. Eventually, they renewed their wedding vows in the same hospital chapel where she had once cried alone. Or think about the story of Terry Schiavo, whose controversial case sparked national debate in the U.S. Regardless of which side people stood on, the emotional centerpiece of that story was one simple truth: families and caregivers carry immense emotional weight when caring for someone who can't respond. And that emotional labor often goes unseen. Anna's story gives voice to that quiet heroism. She didn't just care for Grant, she bore witness to his pain. She held space for his return. And when he finally emerged from the darkness, it wasn't with a crown, but with a question: who am I now? And that is the question every survivor asks, whether from a coma, a breakup, an illness, or a trauma. Who am I now in the aftermath? The answer is never static. But in Grant's case, it became clear he was a man changed by presence, by grace, by a woman who stayed when she had every reason to walk away. Their connection wasn't about saving, it was about staying. And that, more than any fairy tale rescue, is the true miracle in this story. Every love story has a turning point, a moment where unspoken feelings rise to the surface, and everything that was once safe in silence demands to be said aloud. For Anna and Grant, that moment came not in the grand halls of a mansion or at the conclusion of a dramatic rescue, but under the stars, in the stillness of a hospital garden, where vulnerability and honesty replaced all the formalities that usually mask our emotions. Grant was still learning how to walk without assistance, how to speak without slurring his words. But that night, as they sat side by side on the stone bench, what he said came out clearer than any sentence he had practiced: I trust you. And trust, as we've said before, is the soil from which love can truly grow. He didn't say I love you then, and neither did she. They didn't have to. There's a sacredness to the slow build, the quiet recognition that something profound is blooming, even when words haven't caught up yet. The next few weeks changed everything, not because of any one event, but because of accumulation. Small things. The way Anna's hand lingered a little longer when helping him sit up. The way Grant's eyes followed her across the room. The way their laughter started sounding like a shared language. That's how real intimacy works. It's not built on grand declarations, but on presence, attention, and consistency. But even as love gently bloomed between them, life outside the hospital was racing forward. With Nathan Carter behind bars and public sympathy leaning toward Grant after the truth about the crash came out, media attention soared. Carter Enterprises' stock climbed. Board members who once counted him out now wanted him back in the seat of power. But the Grant who was waking up each morning beside a tray of herbal tea and a nurse who whispered good morning wasn't the same man who once obsessed over quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. He was no longer driven by dominance. He was driven by purpose. And that purpose now had a name: Anna. Still, the pull of responsibility was real. He owed it to the people who had supported him. He owed it to the company he'd built. And so with Anna's blessing, he returned. Not to reclaim control in the old way, but to lead differently. His first public appearance post-coma was a press conference that stunned reporters, not for its slick presentation, but for its sincerity. Gone was the icy, calculated CEO. In his place stood a man who had faced death and found clarity. I spent a year trapped in silence, he said, but in that silence I learned more about connection than I did in decades of business. From now on, this company will be led with both strategy and soul. The reaction was electric. Not everyone believed him, of course. Cynics will always exist, but those who'd known the old Grant saw the change, and they respected it. Still, while the public praised his recovery and investors celebrated his return, the part of Grant that mattered most wasn't being broadcast. It was the quiet way he leaned on Anna each night, the way he asked her about her dreams, the way he started dreaming, too, of a life not just rebuilt, but redefined. One evening, he took her to the rooftop of the Carter estate. The city skyline stretched endlessly before them, painted in amber and gold. I used to stand up here alone, he admitted, thinking this view was everything. But it always felt cold. Until now. Anna smiled, but the emotion in her eyes said more than any words could. He stepped closer. I don't remember when I fell in love with you, he continued, but I do know that it happened slowly, deeply, and completely. And then without ceremony or spectacle, he pulled out a velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring that sparkled under the fading sun. But even its brilliance was nothing compared to the softness in his voice when he said, Anna Monroe, will you marry me? In that instant, the world quieted. There were no camera flashes, no media headlines. Just a heartbeat shared between two people who had chosen each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances. Her answer was breathless, but sure. Yes. The simplicity of it, the realness of it was more powerful than any fairy tale. Because it wasn't about rescue. It was about resurrection, not of a man, but of a connection forged in vulnerability. Their wedding was intimate but elegant. The Carter estate, once a monument to wealth, transformed into a sanctuary of love. White roses lined the aisle. String lights danced in the trees. As Anna walked toward him in a simple, breathtaking gown, every guest could feel the weight of what they had endured. And when they exchanged vows, it wasn't just a promise of forever, it was a tribute to everything they'd survived to get there. Afterward, they stole away to the gardens, walking hand in hand under twilight. I thought I had everything before, Grant whispered. Money, power, influence. But I never knew what it meant to be seen until you. Anna didn't need to say anything. The way she leaned into him, the way her head rested gently against his shoulder, said it all. This was home. And here's where we zoom out again, not just to admire the ending, but to explore why it resonates. Because stories like these remind us that love is not always about instant chemistry or fiery passion. Sometimes it's about presence, patience, and timing. It's about who stands beside you when there's no applause, who whispers encouragement when you've forgotten your own strength. And yes, real life offers versions of this too, like the story of Lauren and Matt, two trauma nurses who met during a shared shift and bonded through their care for patients. When Lauren's mother fell into a coma, Matt volunteered his off hours to sit with her, even when Lauren couldn't be there. Eventually, her mother woke up, and the first words she said were, "That nice young man with the gentle voice, he prayed with me." Lauren and Matt married the following year. Or the story of Army vet Marcus and his wife Camille, who met during his rehabilitation after a devastating injury. He couldn't walk, couldn't remember her name half the time, but she showed up every day. Eventually he did walk, and he remembered everything, including how deeply he loved her. These are not scripted fairy tales. They're proof that resilience, patience, and human connection are more powerful than status or circumstances. And that's why Anna and Grant's story matters. Because it mirrors what so many hope for, to be loved not for who we project, but for who we are when the masks fall away. As Grant resumed life, not as the old CEO, but as a partner, a husband, a man finally whole, he never forgot what brought him back. It wasn't the machines. It wasn't the medicine. It was the voice of a woman who talked to him when he couldn't answer, who stayed when others left, who loved him quietly until he could love her back out loud. That's the kind of love we all hope to give and to receive. And in this story, it wasn't born from drama, but from devotion. Quiet, enduring, and real. Life after love stories often gets reduced to credits rolling or wedding bells fading into a sunset. But real love, the kind that's forged in pain, quiet resilience and shared growth, doesn't stop when the curtain falls. In the months that followed their wedding, Grant and Anna discovered this truth firsthand. Their lives weren't filled with grand adventures or world tours, but rather with the daily rhythm of togetherness, the kind of connection that comes from making coffee for two instead of one, from exchanging quiet glances in boardrooms, and from holding hands under the table during difficult conversations. Grant, once a man who measured success in stock tickers and mergers, now measured it in mornings shared and evenings spent reading beside a fireplace. The Carter estate, once cold and cavernous, had transformed under Anna's influence. It was now a home filled with laughter, fresh flowers, and the scent of rosemary chicken that she had learned from her grandmother's handwritten recipe book. And though the world still saw Grant as the media mogul who returned from the brink of death, those closest to him, his new team, his restructured company, his foundation, knew that his power no longer came from dominance, but from empathy. With Anna's encouragement, he launched a private fund for post-trauma rehabilitation, Care One, that prioritized not just recovery, but relationships. Healing doesn't happen in isolation, the foundation's tagline read. It happens when someone chooses to stay, and people noticed. The story of a nurse who refused to walk away from a man no one believed in, and the billionaire who found his humanity in a hospital bed spread across platforms, articles, and interviews. But the heart of the story was never publicity. It was personal. At night when the lights dimmed and the world went quiet, Anna and Grant still shared stories of the past, of imagined futures, of fears that lingered even when everything seemed perfect. They didn't pretend life was flawless. Trauma, after all, leaves shadows. There were nights when Grant jolted awake from dreams he couldn't explain, his body still remembering the crash, even when his mind tried to forget. Anna would hold him, not with words, but with steady arms and a soft voice reminding him, "You're safe now." And there were days when Anna herself questioned everything, the attention, the responsibility, the surreal shift from being a nurse living paycheck to a woman married into unimaginable wealth. But whenever she wavered, Grant reminded her, "None of this matters without you." Their love was not the kind that makes headlines, it was the kind that lasts. Let's take a moment to unpack why this story matters far beyond its romantic veneer. Because beneath the surface of every happily ever after is a choice to show up, a choice to speak gently, a choice to stay, especially when leaving would be easier. Grant's transformation didn't happen because Anna saved him. It happened because she saw him. And in return, he gave her something even rarer than riches, reverence. He didn't just love her, he cherished her. In a world obsessed with status, speed, and spectacle, their story reminds us that the most powerful force in a person's life is often not the breakthrough or the miracle, but the person who never stopped believing in you. Real-life examples continue to echo this theme. Take the story of Carlos and Mireya, a retired couple from Mexico City, who opened their home to a young stranger recovering from an accident, because in Mireya's words, no one heals alone. Or the story of Sarah, a former trauma nurse in Detroit, who adopted the orphan child of a patient who died during surgery, not because it was expected, but because it felt right. When asked why, she said, "I didn't want his child to grow up thinking the world is a place where people disappear." These stories don't trend. They don't always get turned into novels or movies. But they're real. They are testaments to the quiet heroism of ordinary people who choose love not as a feeling, but as a daily decision. That's what Anna did. That's what Grant grew into. And that's what makes their story unforgettable. In the final chapter of their first year together, they decided to do something radical. They returned to the hospital where it all began, not as nurse and patient, but as benefactors. Together, they unveiled a new ward named after Anna's late mother, a woman who taught her through struggle and sacrifice what it meant to care. The Anna Monroe Center for Compassionate Recovery opened its doors on a rainy spring morning. And as Anna cut the ribbon standing beside Grant in the very team who once doubted her, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt grateful. Because love hadn't elevated her above others, it had reminded her of what truly mattered: service, humility, and staying present. That evening back home, Grant surprised her with a simple dinner. Candles, music, soft laughter. "What is this?" she asked, amused. "A celebration," he said. "Not for the hospital, for us." He reached for her hand. "Because somehow we found each other in the dark." And as they clinked glasses, Anna whispered, "We didn't find each other. We chose each other." And that, dear listener, is the takeaway. In a world filled with noise, where love is often marketed as fast and flashy, where healing is expected to happen in days or weeks, this story tells us something radical. It tells us that healing is slow, that love is patient, That being seen, truly seen, is one of the most sacred experiences a human being can have. Whether you're in a hospital room, a boardroom, or simply sitting at home wondering if anyone sees the real you, remember this: you are not invisible. You are worthy of care, of patience, of a love that stays when the lights go out. And if you're in a position to offer that to someone else, don't wait. Be the voice in the silence. Be the hand that lingers. Be the person who chooses to stay. Because sometimes the smallest moments of care, the words said to someone who can't speak back, the meals made for someone who can't eat, alone the hand held when there's nothing left to say, those are the moments that save lives. That's what this story has shown us. Not how to be perfect, but how to be present. And that is a lesson worth remembering, worth living, and worth passing on.